Thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk about Zimbabwean soldiers who are in exile in South Africa, who are living in South Africa in exile, army deserters who deserted the Zimbabwe National Army in post-2000 political crisis. So what I'm much more interested in doing here is to talk more about issues that has to do with how a sense of violence, how in particular that violence is trained and embedded in particular bodies. So the question around soldiers and soldiery has to do with military training in this regard, the ways in which soldiers are trained, the ways in which soldiers are being made to understand the volitions of violence is particularly interesting in the sense that when the state makes violence, it depends on particular resources, in this case, soldiers. So what it does is that the state resource in training soldiers, and it is actually very difficult for the state, it's quite a lot of work for the state to train ordinary civilians, to train young boys into soldiers, men who are going to be trained in doing violence. And this violence, when it is trained by the state into the bodies of these soldiers, it becomes legitimated violence. And that legitimated violence, in particular, if one reads the works of John Toppy in 1998, talking about the expropriation of the means of doing violence by the state itself. So what it means here is that the state is actually very much interested in soldiers and soldiery because it expropriates the means of doing violence from ordinary citizens. And in this regard, the state itself is quite very greedy in the notion of violence because it expropriates the means of doing violence from any ordinary citizen, and it is legitimated to the soldiers who do the violence on behalf of the state for the state itself to survive. So in actual fact, what is interesting in this regard surrounding the concept of legitimation of violence is the idea that in actual fact, there is a blindness on what is legitimate violence and illegitimate violence when soldiers go outside the barracks to live a life which is actually very independent of the state. So what soldiers do, in many cases, they do violence, and often people refer to this form of violence as the violence of the state, even if it is violence that is embedded and produced and reappropriated by the soldiers themselves beyond the barracks themselves. So what it therefore means in this regard is that the question around transitioning from the mind of doing violence to the mind of being a civilian, when soldiers leave the barracks, when the soldiers leave the military, it is quite interesting in the sense that that transition from being a soldier to a civilian is quite a very difficult transition. And often people talk about this idea of transition from soldiers to civilian. But what people do not understand and comprehend in terms of the conceptualization of the idea of transition is the idea that transition has to be questioned when we talk about soldiers, men who have spent all their lives doing violence, men who have spent their time being legitimated and celebrated in killing, men who have been spending their lives exercising violence. So how do these soldiers, how do these military men shrug off the past? How do they live behind the past? So in this regard, people talk about the idea of demilitarizing the mind. How does one demilitarize a mind that has been inculcated and a mind that has been celebrated with violence? So in this regard, one has therefore to understand that the notion of transitioning from ways of doing violence, from ways in which violence is being celebrated to ways in which violence is illegitimated, it becomes problematic. And there is actually a thin line when we talk about transition. What is it that soldiers are transitioning from? Where are they transitioning from? And where are they transitioning to with regards to the production and the reproduction and the reappropriation of the military past, which is embedded in their minds. So it is quite important for one to understand that what has been ingrained in the mind, what has been embedded and inculcated in the mind, is actually very difficult to leave behind. Why is it difficult to leave behind? Because that transition is often expected by the community in which the soldiers are transitioning to. That expectation, in many cases, it actually puts a lot of pressure on soldiers who are leaving behind the past and trying to embrace the civilian community. But this civilian community is actually a community, in particular in South Africa, where these exiled soldiers find themselves. It is an exiled community of violence, embedded and embodied with gangsters, embodied and ingrained with the celebration of guns. So in this regard, one therefore talks about the skills and the unskilling of soldiers themselves in a context in which that violence continues to be produced by the context in which they find themselves in. So how do we then therefore expect a soldier to leave behind that violence mentality, that legitimated violence mentality, which has been ingrained by the state? But in this regard, or in this context, the exiled soldiers find themselves in a context in which violence is also being celebrated by gangsters. So in that regard, they find themselves producing and continue to embrace particular military identities, which are in themselves quite harmful. And can we think of soldiers in this regard as innocuous human beings, men who are not actually very hazardous to the context in which they find themselves? The expectation by the community itself, the community do and does expect that soldiers, in particular, in my doing of research in the South African Black townships, I found out that in particular, former soldiers, even those from the South African context, those soldiers, what they do is that they try to deal with gang violence in a way in which they find peaceful means to negotiate with the gangsters, to stop the fighting, to stop killing, and to stop the violence and the criminality in those contexts in which they live. So what is very interesting in this regard is the question that surrounds the concept of expectation. Expectation in terms of analysis is one of the interesting concepts when we talk about violence, because oftentimes people do expect someone to do violence, but also they do expect someone to deal with that violence, which is actually happening within the community. So even though the community do expect particular soldiers or exiled soldiers, together with South African ex-combatants, to deal with men who utilize guns, what it does is that the expectation in terms of analysis, what it does is that it is actually perpetuating the violence which has been ingrained in soldiers' mentality in the past. But also in terms of theory, we can then therefore talk about expectation in terms of the entitlement to particular places and landscapes of violence. Because if one therefore begins to expect a soldier to deal with violence, what you are doing in this case, you are doing the idea of making soldiers understand violence as theirs in a way in which they are expected to deal with this form of violence. So in terms of analysis, the question around expectation does perpetuate violence in the context in which these men are embedded with the issue of violence. So it is quite important for us to understand that the doing of violence in particular, it's quite hard work. It is hard work in the sense that those who are trained into doing violence, those who are trained into legitimate killing, those who understand killing as a skill, it becomes problematic to understand and to embrace the life world of a civilian. Because the life world of a civilian is one in which even soldiers themselves are being denigrated. They are viewed as killers. They are viewed as people who always do violence. So in this regard, what it means therefore is that soldiers themselves or exiled soldiers are torn in between the question around integration in those civilian communities, but at the same time, the same community expects them to deal with the violence which they face in those particular communities. So how do then therefore soldiers leave behind what they learned in the past? So violence then therefore becomes a way of life, not a way of life in terms of the objectification of violence, that is the doing of violence by the exiled soldiers. But in particular, it becomes a way of life in terms of the thinking that goes around in the everyday life of a soldier, the worldview within that particular civilian context. So the idea of trying to understand what it means to do violence and what it means to be peaceful in a context which is ingrained with violence, in a context in which expectation to deal with violence, and in a context in which that context produces other forms of violence becomes quite problematic. And that violence becomes sedimented. It is sedimented in the sense that it is not only about soldiers doing the violence in its physicality, but also the ways in which they continue to think about this violence becomes quite problematic, and it is an issue at stake. But also one therefore also has to understand that for men who have spent their lives being trained into violence, violence becomes a source of capital. When we talk about the source of capital, I'm drawing from Pierre Bourdieu's understanding of capital as part of that individual social capital, which can produce particular social networks. Because oftentimes we take it for granted that people do form and forge and sustain particular relationships in particular contexts. But what it means therefore is that violence becomes a skill. Violence becomes a source of networking. Violence becomes a source of identity. But in that context, where soldiers do not find meaningful work, where soldiers are being denigrated by the community in which they are trying to integrate, violence becomes a source of their way of being, of who they are, where they belong. So it is quite important to interrogate these issues when we think about the transition from men who have been made to do violence by the state, but oftentimes when they do integrate, we take it for granted that they have to automatically integrate in those communities. In fact, it's quite problematic to understand all these issues. So a skill, we all have different skills on these platforms. So the skills in which we have been trained to understand, if we move to a particular context, which is a different context in which we gained that skill, it might be at a university, you move beyond the university and you continue to use and utilize the skill that you have gained from that university. But what is interesting with the skill is that the migration of a skill becomes important in this regard. How a skill migrates and how a skill becomes produced in particular context. If one therefore draws from Pierre Bourdieu's idea of habitats, in which a particular field of migration becomes a context and a field in which a skill is habituated and reproduced and in a way reappropriated. So in this given sense, that idea of legitimation and illegitimation, it becomes blurred, it becomes clouded in the sense that soldiers do not have that sense of understanding that what they often used to do in the past is no longer legitimated, is no longer celebrated, is no longer part of their identities which are produced in that particular context. So the idea of leaving behind other identities and embracing civilian identities, but also interestingly in this regard, when we think about gangsters who do kill, who do crime, who do commit forms of violence, how do we then therefore think of the idea of trying to delegitimize the context which has been normalized, in particular in the South African context, where even soldiers have been continued to be deployed to deal with violence of gangsters. So in this regard, it becomes problematic to deal with questions that surrounds the military mentality, where a context celebrates violence in particular. Thank you, Nyaleti.